Have you ever felt incapable of facing a big problem because you thought you didn't have enough resources or skills? This feeling is common, but we often forget that in the right hands, even the smallest resource can become a powerful tool. That's how it is with God. The little we have can be enough for great transformations. Today, I want to show you how this applies to you. Imagine a farmer holding a tiny seed. He could dismiss it because of its size, but he knows that by planting it, that small seed can grow into a fruitful tree, full of life. In the same way, what we hold in our hands, no matter how small it seems, can yield extraordinary results if we surrender it to the Creator. This is the principle behind so many stories in the Bible. God never expects us to have everything or to be perfect. He invites us to trust Him and offer what we have. It might be an underestimated talent, a seemingly insufficient financial resource, or even a simple idea. What He desires is the willingness of our hearts and the faith in His power. After all, it's not about the amount but the act of surrender. Why then do we tend to undervalue what we have? Perhaps it's because we live in a culture that celebrates the big, the complex, the flashy. But in God's economy, the small is often the starting point for the greatest miracles. God looks at the heart, not at the size of what we give. In the upcoming chapters, we'll explore stories that illustrate this principle. Moses, with a simple staff, was used to liberate a nation. A widow with just a little oil saw her provision multiplied. A boy with a few loaves and fish fed thousands. Each of these stories began with what was already in their hands. For now, I want you to reflect. What do you have today? It might be something you don't even consider significant. But what if God is already waiting for you to offer it to Him? Many times, the miracle we seek is already within our reach, simply waiting to be placed in God's hands. This is the essence of our journey in this video. Now that we understand the value of little, let's dive into the story of Moses and how his staff became a powerful tool in the hands of God. You'll see how the ordinary can become extraordinary when guided by the Creator. Picture Moses, a man fleeing from his past, living as a shepherd in the desert. In his hands, he carried nothing more than a wooden staff. A common object used to guide sheep, it seemed to symbolize his life. Simple, unremarkable, without great impact. Yet God had other plans. That staff would be transformed into a symbol of power, used to liberate an entire nation. Moses' calling came from a burning bush. God chose him to lead the Israelites, but Moses hesitated. He felt inadequate, small, and unprepared. Then God asked, "What is that in your hand?" Moses looked down at his staff. It was just a piece of wood, but God saw more. In that moment, the ordinary was consecrated for something extraordinary. With that same staff, Moses performed astonishing signs before Pharaoh. He threw it to the ground, and it became a serpent. Later, he raised it, and the Red Sea parted, allowing the Israelites to escape. The staff, when surrendered to God, became a tool of miracles, transforming impossible circumstances into victories. The lesson here is clear. God doesn't need something great to act. He uses what we already have. Moses wasn't given a miraculous arsenal. He used what was already in his hands. But to do so, he had to trust God. His obedience turned the simple into something that changed the course of history. What about you? You might look at what you have and think, is this all? But Moses' example reminds us that God doesn't ask for what you don't have. He asks for what you already possess. When we offer our little to God, He makes it sufficient for great things. Now let's move on to another story where the little became much. A widow with a small jar of oil, whose obedience and faith led to a miraculous provision. Imagine a woman facing despair. The widow mentioned in 2 Kings 4 was in a desperate situation, deep in debt and at risk of losing her sons to slavery as payment. At that moment, she couldn't see a way out. Her resources were minimal, practically non-existent. All she had was a small jar of oil, something that seemed completely insufficient to solve such a massive problem. Elisha, the prophet of God, heard her cry and asked her a simple question: "What do you have in your house?" Her answer was direct and full of discouragement. "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Sometimes, when we're at our lowest, even what we have seems insignificant, but God doesn't see things as we do. Elisha instructed the widow to do something unusual: borrow as many jars as she could from her neighbors, many jars, and begin pouring her small amount of oil into them. The act of obedience may have seemed strange, but she trusted. And then the miracle happened. The oil flowed continuously until every jar was full, providing enough to pay her debts and sustain her family. This story is a powerful reminder that the little in our hands becomes enough when placed in God's hands. The widow had a choice: to dismiss what she had as too small, or to trust and surrender it to God's direction. The result was multiplication, something that seemed impossible until she took that first step of faith. How often do we undervalue what we have, believing it doesn't matter? God teaches us that obedience and faith in using what we already have open the door to miracles. Like the widow, we need to identify what's within our reach and place it in the Lord's hands. Next, we'll explore another transformative example: a boy with a basket of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Something small, yet it fed a multitude. This is the next step in our journey of how God uses what we have to achieve the impossible. Picture a massive crowd, over 5,000 people gathered to hear Jesus speak. The day was drawing to a close, and the disciples were concerned. "Send the crowd away so they can buy food," they suggested. But Jesus, with compassion in his eyes, responded with something unexpected: "You give them something to eat." It was a challenge that seemed impossible with the limited resources they had. Among the crowd, a young boy stepped forward with a small basket. He had just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, something that seemed utterly insignificant compared to the overwhelming need. Yet, he offered what he had. Jesus took the boy's humble gift, looked to heaven, gave thanks, and began to divide it. That's when the miracle unfolded. Everyone ate until they were satisfied, and 12 baskets of leftovers remained. What stands out in this story is not just the miracle, but the boy's willingness to give what he had. He didn't keep it for himself, even knowing it wasn't enough for everyone. In his hands, those loaves and fish were ordinary, but in Jesus' hands, they became a supernatural provision for thousands. This story teaches us that God doesn't rely on large resources to accomplish great things. He only needs a heart willing to surrender. Like the boy, we must realize that what seems small to us may be exactly what God wants to use to bless others. Think about this. What do you have in your hands today? It might seem small, but if you trust and place it in God's hands, He can do far more than you imagine. The miracle begins when we offer what we have with faith. What's in your hands might be the key to changing lives around you. Think about this. What do you have in your hands today? It might seem small, but if you trust and place it in God's hands, He can do far more than you imagine. The miracle begins when we offer what we have with faith. What's in your hands might be the key to changing lives around you. Now let's move on to another example of God using the unexpected. With Samson, God used an unlikely tool, a donkey's jawbone, to achieve a great victory. This story shows us how the improbable can become the key to overcoming challenges. Imagine Samson, surrounded by 1,000 Philistines, armed only with his strength and whatever he could find nearby. In a situation that seemed hopeless, he picked up something unexpected: the jawbone of a donkey. To most, it would have been nothing more than a useless piece of bone. But in Samson's hands, guided by the Spirit of God, it became a powerful weapon. With that jawbone, Samson defeated his enemies and achieved an extraordinary victory. After the battle, he declared, With a donkey's jawbone, I have struck down 1,000 men. The message is clear. God can use even the most improbable of tools to bring deliverance. It's not about what we have, it's about what God does with what we surrender to Him. This story challenges us to look differently at the resources and situations around us. How often do we dismiss something or someone because we think it's inadequate or insufficient? Samson didn't question what he found. He acted with faith, knowing his strength came from God. And because of that, something common became the key to his victory. It's important to remember that it wasn't the jawbone that brought the victory, but God's power working through it. This teaches us that even the most limiting circumstances can be transformed into opportunities when we trust in the Lord. Even in the face of adversity, God can surprise us. Samson's story is a reminder that the improbable, when placed in God's hands, can become enough to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. And this applies to us today. What's in your hands that seems small or insignificant? God may be ready to use it to bring victories in your life. Next, we'll reflect on how all these stories connect to your own journey. What's in your hands right now that you've yet to place in God's hands? Let's explore this deeper in the next chapter. Now that we've seen how God used what was in the hands of Moses, the widow, the boy, and Samson, one question arises. What's in your hands today? Too often, we underestimate our own resources and abilities, believing they're not enough. But each of these stories teaches us that the power doesn't lie in what we have. It lies in what God can do with it. Think about the situations you're facing. Maybe you feel limited, like the widow with her small jar of oil, or overwhelmed by great challenges, like the boy with his basket. God isn't asking you to solve everything on your own. He simply wants you to offer what you already have. It's in this act of surrender that miracles begin to happen. Start by evaluating what's within your reach. It could be a talent you consider simple, like your ability to listen and give advice. Or maybe a financial resource you think is too small to make a difference. Whatever it is, remember, in God's hands, even the smallest resources can multiply in supernatural ways. Another important lesson is obedience. Moses raised his staff, the widow gathered jars, the boy gave up his basket. Samson picked up the jawbone. Each of them took a step of faith before witnessing the miracle. Taking action in obedience demonstrates trust in God, and this trust is what opens the door to the impossible. These stories also teach us humility, the need to acknowledge that, on our own, we are limited. It requires admitting our weaknesses and relying on God. The widow could have dismissed her small jar of oil as too little to make a difference. Samson could have despaired at finding only a jawbone, yet both trusted God, and the result was victory. Now look at your own life. What are you holding on to that you haven't yet placed in God's hands? It could be something you think is insignificant or inadequate. But remember, God doesn't choose what seems great by human standards. He chooses what's available and willing to be used. We've reached the most important part of this reflection, how to apply these lessons to your life. By now, you've seen how God can use what's in our hands to create miracles. But knowing this isn't enough, it's time to act. The first step is simple yet powerful. Recognize what you have and trust it in God's hands, even if it seems small or insignificant. Start by looking within yourself. What's your staff? Maybe it's a talent you think is ordinary, like your ability to organize, communicate, or encourage others. It might be a resource, an idea, or even your time. What feels ordinary in your hands can become extraordinary in God's hands. All He asks is your willingness to surrender it. The next step is to act in faith. So often we want to see the miracle before taking the first step, but the stories we've explored show us that obedience comes before multiplication. Moses raised his staff before the sea parted. The widow gathered jars before the oil was multiplied. The boy offered his basket before the crowd was fed. Faith is not about waiting to see. It's about stepping forward, trusting God to act. It's also crucial to let go of the fear of failure. We hesitate, thinking that our little won't make a difference. But God doesn't require much. He needs hearts willing to trust Him. Samson's story reminds us that even the most unlikely tool can bring a surprising victory when guided by God. Don't underestimate the power of a simple act of surrender. Now the decision is yours. What do you have in your hands today? It doesn't matter if it seems small or ordinary. God is ready to transform it into something far greater than you can imagine. All He's waiting for is your surrender. Remember, it's not about what we have, but what God can do with what we offer Him. Finally, I challenge you to take action today. Reflect on what you have and pray, asking God to use it powerfully. Maybe it's a small act of kindness, a forgotten talent, or even a gesture of encouragement. Place it in God's hands and see what He can do. Let this message encourage you. God never asks for much. Just trust, offer the little, believe in the great, and witness the impossible. The miracle you've been waiting for may be closer than you think, waiting for your faith and surrender.